Hello everyone, I am Jonathan, also known as the PC Genie, and today we're going to be talking about police tactics for riots specifically and other similar situations compared with historical tactics used in things like the medieval period, Roman period, other various areas where close combat weapons and things were used, comparing when they had to be used for military purposes back then and having to be used for crowd control now. And also perhaps a bit of crowd control and law and order also historically as well, which I'll touch on. Now I'll talk about some tactics and things because that's what was originally requested in the wish that caused this video, but I'll also talk about certain things about weapons and armour and things to give a general picture so I can give a bit more to compare. So in terms of the sorts of equipment and things, let's start with that. So of course, when you look at police in riots, you can easily see some fairly obvious contrasts between the historical eras and now, in the fact you've got blunt instruments. I'm just going to pick up my crowbar, and you'd have things like a telescopic baton or a solid baton, which usually I think it's called a tonfa, which has sort of a parrying notch and also an extra type of grip on the side, which is a bit different to what you'd get historically. So previously there are obvious blunt weapons such as clubs and sticks, but also maces and warhammers. And it made me think actually, because there is one particular type of mace which seemed a bit unusual, and that is called the bar mace. Now the bar mace is, well, like it says, it's sort of a mace it's got, that's the term we give to it now. I don't know what it was called historically, but it's a type of mace that, rather than like the standard versions, having just the handle and then the weight concentrated at the end, whether it was a heavy kind of mace or even quite a lightweight weapon, even if it was, quite light and easy to swing around, it still had most of the force concentrated at the top, at the very head, for maximum damage for the swing that you're giving. Whereas the bar mace doesn't do that. It's more like a baseball bat from the versions I've seen from reproductions and the museum originals. It seems that it does get wider at the tip, so that you've got more force towards the front than you might experience on a sword, which is more back-weighted. But it still is more evenly balanced. So if you were using it and swinging for an attack against, someone with armour, without armour, using whatever equipment, you're not going to be able to put as much force in. And this would be for the same weight and potentially a similar-ish sort of balance. So in terms of how quickly you could attack, it might be a bit better when it's slightly more back-weighted on a bar mace. But like I said, if you wanted something that was light and quick, but still had a lot of damage potential, you just get a lighter version of a mace. And I've seen, replicas and museum originals of things like warhammers and maces that had, a bulbous end, so you can still smash through things, but they were smaller and more lightweight, so that you could use them quicker rather than lumbering around with them. And then it makes me think, so if you've got either heavier versions for even more damage, or the lightweight versions, which are perfectly fine. I said smaller, they are usually of equal length, and still have that concentrated mass, they're still really effective. So why go for something that's a bit more equivalent to this crowbar, not nearly as effective in striking, when it's not going to do much? Because bearing in mind with swords, you have the edge all the way along, so that you can use the edge, so even if I hit close to the handle, I've still got it on somewhere like the neck or an exposed arm or something like that, and I can slice. I can do a push cut, a pull cut, I can do things like that, or I can deliberately just use it to bind. The edge sort of digs in if you've got the thing opposing a blade or something like that. So it binds things, it allows you to slice into things, so that's why swords have that damage potential all the way along. But on something like a mace, I'm doing a full force swing, it does hurt my hand a bit, but if I did that with the end, I'd have broken my hand by now, whereas back here, I mean, it stings a little, and yeah, it's basically recovered by now already. So having something like a mace that's doing that, even if it has got a bit more weight and ability to do damage a bit further back, realistically, it'll only be very effective at the very tip still. So I was there thinking, you know, for ages, so why would you have such an ineffective weapon? Why not have a heavy mace or a light mace, warhammer, something like that? What's going on? But then I realised, actually, you look at something like the tonfa and a telescopic baton, bringing this back on point, and you see that actually it could be used as something like a law enforcement weapon. It's more sturdy and more able to cause damage than a club or a stick. So it's more intimidating, it's going to cause criminals to think twice before going up against you. But it's not something like a mace or a warhammer where you're probably going to kill them with it. You know, it's a balance between you want the weapon to be serious and intimidating, but you'd rather capture and teach those criminals a lesson rather than have to fill a load of graves with them, you know? And that's where I guess the bar mace comes in. Now, I haven't got any specific evidence or anecdotes or accounts that say that the bar mace was used specifically for law enforcement, but going by the practicality of it, I theorise that's probably what it was used for, in my opinion. So you see that you can have these sorts of weapons which, even in a modern period, you've got to have it serious enough, but not cause too much damage. And I wonder if maybe standards in terms of human rights and in terms of, you know, not killing or crippling or, you know, otherwise causing permanent harm to people is more of a priority these days, perhaps. You know, again, with things like human rights laws passed all across Europe and beyond. Then you see why they've switched from steel weapons and other, you know, things like swords and spears and things which could be used for, you know, guarding an area, and also things like the bar mace, down to things like the telescopic baton and the solid baton, which, yes, are made of sturdy materials that can injure or kill very seriously, but are less inclined to do so, if you know what I mean. And it's interesting in the fact that I see this reflected across all of the equipment, because you also see similar items that have pretty much been unchanged except with modern materials, like in Riot gear. You have helmets and other types of body armor. You have the breastplate, bits to protect the areas like forearms, upper arms, the legs down to the feet, all of that full kit, which is very reminiscent of things like brigandine armor or plate armor, and I'll talk more about armor in a second. It shows that although those things have just been adapted of modern materials, perhaps with things like how people deal with criminals has changed in the fact that it's less lethal, rather than smashing someone's skull in with a mace or just going to someone with a crossbow and shooting them. Instead, you have to look at things like those water jets that they use. They've also got things like tear gas, which obviously is non-fatal, rubber bullets instead of deadly rounds, and other equivalents like that. Even in things like the shields, I mean, you could actually have certain shields of the bosses, so you could concentrate impact and potentially do things like catch weapons and whatnot. I mean, admittedly, it goes off into whether a boss is more of a deadly weapon or whether it's more to catch weapons. That's still subject of debate, but you see how it's less deadly and less serious, even though the police obviously still want to be treated seriously. And it creates this interesting sort of compromise that you see in society between making sure the police are effective, but also making sure they're not too aggressive, and in things like the training as well. So now when you look at things like the general tactics and the similarities, and I've noticed looking at documentaries like, I think it's called In Their Own Eyes, which was looking at some previous riots that happened in Britain, and this time was through the eyes of the police themselves, recounting the terrifying effects of having bottles of, you know, Molotov cocktails thrown at them, rocks, bricks and all sorts of things, injuring people. And they mentioned specifically certain instances where tactics were quite important as well. For example, they made sure to line up not quite as a shield wall, because a historical shield wall would consist of many more people and they'd be tightly packed to each other, with their shields overlapping. Whereas in the footage, you see that they are more loosely spaced apart, but showing that general formation where they're holding a line and trying to secure a particular funnel, in this case a street. But they did mention that they weren't going to, well, they actually weren't allowed to go further than certain points, because you'd get a junction which might lead off, let's say, there's a road going forwards and also a road going to the left, and they worried that if they went any further forward, in standard sort of guerrilla warfare tactics, maybe the looters and rioters would wisen up to the fact that they're in this sort of area, and potentially, pin them from the front, attack them in the sides, attack them in the rear, and totally surround them. They actually explicitly say that. They didn't want to bring the officers any further forward. Although the rioters realised this and were freely able to control and loot certain areas, they said they were going to prioritise the lives of the officers first, and they did that by making sure not to let them go into any areas where they could get flanked. Because, of course, if flanking manoeuvres are able to be done, even with their good training and their good formation, of course, being attacked in the side or the rear, as has been the case from all the way in the Stone Age through to now, it has always been important not to get attacked in the flanks or in the rear, and it still holds true. And it's interesting to see how that sort of medieval style tactic of holding a shield wall, making sure you don't get flanked, making sure you control areas, that's another thing they mentioned. They were trying to, although they were prioritising lives over property, they said in the documentary I watched, they were saying that apart from that, they were making sure to hold and control areas, so they were able to, even if they couldn't fully disperse the people, by using more aggressive tactics to run towards them and have a show of force, even if not actually engaging, to disperse them, which worked a few times. Even if that didn't work, they were still able to hold ground. Projectiles were being thrown at them, and they were using their shields and their armour to cover them, to make sure they stayed alive, and indeed it helped, because as far as I can tell, nobody actually died that day, luckily. And it's interesting because with the armour and weapons, you imagine with, guns and all sorts of things these days, people seem to sort of ignore armour almost when talking about things like military shooters and the rest. It almost is a side topic. And in things like first-person shooters, it's all like a headshot is just, that's it, you're killed. But in reality, armour is extremely important. And I imagine that, any officers or constables that were out there who didn't have armour, and indeed in the particular case covered by the documentary, some of them didn't have, weren't all fully equipped with armour because there was so little to go around. It was such an extreme emergency scenario. It actually left them quite vulnerable, whereas the people who had armour were much more able to stand their ground, because you could have a projectile like a brick, and yes, it could knock you, even unconscious, but with the armour protecting you, it means that you can take those hits without dying. And when you're in a situation where you don't want to go out guns blazing, bring the military in, they're the looters, open fire, historically and now, you don't want to go around killing people who are supposed to be the ones you're protecting. It's a bit ironic. Protect and serve. Oh, we won't protect you. So it's interesting in the fact that you can help to compensate rather than just going in and perhaps using aggressive weapons like the crossbow or up to automatic firearms. Instead, you can stand and almost turn the other cheek, so to speak. You stand the ground, and you can use things like the armour and the shields to compensate for that. So you do need it a lot more. You need to depend on the equipment that is going to protect you more when you're not so much allowed to, retaliate back with forceful strikes, with gunshots, with, fire or other aggressive measures, because people will get killed and it will start to cause this divide between society and the police, which you don't want to have happening. And it causes this interesting situation where you've got armour, like Riot armour, where it's needing to cover the whole body. And it's great that you've got, I can't remember what it is, it's some sort of plastic. They have a particular material that they're able to use in modern technology for visors. Historically, knights and men-at-arms had helmets with visors so you could resist various projectiles and close combat weapons. but you had to have thin sort of slits or grills and things for a visor, so you could see, but you couldn't see nearly as well. Whereas with police riot equipment, you can have something that's completely translucent, save for the scratches and smoke and ash on it, and have a fairly open face design. And that's something I think helps as a major advantage. Although I noticed in the documentary they were still complaining about how the armour was quite cumbersome despite lightweight synthetic materials, and also they couldn't see and breathe as easily, so it suggests that the same old problems with armour, with visibility, weight, mobility, still have a few kinks that need to be ironed out, but I imagine it's much better nowadays than it was historically, when you had things like steel armour and you either had to lift your visor, which left your face exposed to projectiles and things, or have the visor down and very much restrict your vision. Excuse me, these days at least you've got a Hovis loaf, a best of both, you know, where you can actually have the visibility, but also a good bit of the, you know, the protection as well on the face. So that's that. I mean, there's only so much I can discuss about being, you know, trained by the police, and I won't pretend I'm an expert on the subject. I have my knowledge about medieval history and things like that, and I've learnt a bit about the sorts of equipment that the police use. But it's worth saying that I'm not, you know, I'm not part of the police, and therefore there's only so much I can say. But I hope this was at least informative and entertaining. So, I shall see you later, and make your wishes, I shall grant them. Cheers!